Welcome back to Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, we are joined by Marcus Cribb. He's
Hello.
coming to you from his turret somewhere in England. And today we're pretty much going to be talking about the Battle of Quatre Bras.
So hopefully everyone's is enjoying this.
So on the 16th of June, it's 6 a.m. We're at Quatre Bras. At this point, the 2nd Netherlands Division under General Perponche is occupying the crossroads there.
The terrain is flat. So you've got incredibly flat, lush countryside. It really is an agricultural centre, still today. But the terrain is pan flat, really. There are sunken roads and hedgerows, and that's where the skirmishing and the cavalry are really coming into. But if it wasn't for the odd tree line, you can almost see the top of the Mont Saint Jean Ridge, which forms the centre point of the Battle of Waterloo, from Quatre Bras. It's also on quite a straight parallel. The rest of the countryside there's some good old straight roads, and that's really what the Battle of Quatre Bras is fighting for. And when you look, you'll see why, because the Charleroi to Brussels road intersects along Quatre Bras, and off to the east it's heading off towards Ligny. It's
a subtle position. The ground is gently rolling. People at the time talked about that there was a very slight rise at Quatre Bras.
It's not eminently defensible.
No.
It's not like Wellington's favourite ground. You're just not going to find that in Belgium. But it's certainly not there at Quatre Bras. It's a strategic area.
And it's dotted with farms at this period of time. It's got some low ground on the Dutch left flank towards the area village or hamlet of Tiel. And as we were saying, these roads bisect the area. When we're going to be talking about this, we're going to be throwing names around. So remember that the north-south road is the Brussels-Charleroi main road, and the east-west one.
Namur to the east. Yes.
Yeah, and we've briefly mentioned how small Waterloo is as a battlefield, but Quatre Bras is ridiculously small. Closed in 1815 by two large, thick woods. But on the Dutch left flank is what they call the Bois de Loup, and on the Dutch right flank is the much larger Bois de Boisseau. And they enclose a triangle of open, flat ground, which is cultivated fields and pastures. It runs for about 2,500 yards between the forests at its widest point. And between Quatre Bras and the chateau and farm of Jamiencourt, which constitutes at this point, Jamiencourt is the centre of the Dutch forward line, it's only about 1,500 yards between Quatre Bras and Jamiencourt. And this is the field that is going to be contested. At the 2nd, there's not a lot of men there. There's only 8,000 men of the Dutch Belgians. And opposing them is Marshal Ney.
They're holding it. They've, I think, got about 9 rounds a man, which is a lot less than they should be carrying. It's partially down to supply issues, but also down to the fact that parts of the brigade have been fighting during the morning. And they've got Ney. It's worth pointing at this point that Ney's orders were initially very clear. They were to fall upon the crossroads and seize them. Now, he doesn't do this. And it's a huge turning point in history, and there's a lot of different opinions as to why. One prevailing one, and we were saying it's quite a flat, featureless area, is he's been at a battle against Wellington with a British contingent before. And I believe Ney was cautious. He was known as the bravest of the brave. He's known for his charge. But I think here, when he's been given a really sizable contingent of the Emperor's army, he's overly cautious. And he doesn't fall upon the crossroads. He later says that he was actually waiting for further orders from the Emperor and tries to turn it back on Napoleon, which sends him into a fit of rage.
That's a favoured explanation of why. My personal inclination at the 2nd, Ney appeared on the 15th of June, having been summoned about the week before. He arrived with the army on and was given his command, which comprised Napoleon's left wing. On the roadside, he was given this command on the roadside as Napoleon was driving the Prussians towards Fleurus. Napoleon ordered him to take the crossroads of Quatre Bras. At this point, there was about 4 hours of daylight left when he actually arrived at just south of the Quatre Bras position, and he didn't have a lot of men with him. Neither did he know exactly where his entire massive, about 40,000 men were. For instance, the First Corps under Comte d'Erlon was still crossing the Sambre at this point, and by 6 a.m. he only had 3 divisions of Second Corps, the cavalry division of that corps, up with him at Quatre Bras.
He still has superior numbers.
He does, roughly getting up to 20,000 men.
And he's just not using them as a steamroller, which is what is required. So it's probably worth staying. The idea being actually the Quatre Bras is only really meant to take the morning or the early afternoon. He's meant to hit Quatre Bras, seize it, hold it, and then swing east towards Ligny, at which point both Ney's force and d'Erlon's corps are actually meant to fall upon what will then be the right flank of the Prussians, forcing a hammer blow and forcing them away from the British.
At the second, d'Erlon is about 6 miles south of both Ney and Napoleon. Now, I think that Ney wanted to basically mass his entire force, so he knew where everybody was, and to then attack. He has enough men to take it, as we will see as the battle opens. But those hours have allowed Wellington's widely dispersed army to get closer and closer and closer. The roads behind Quatre Bras at this minute are clogged with Allied infantry trying to get through to this position.
There's only 2 roads that are coming in. If they're coming in from the west, Nivelles, or if they're coming in from Brussels.
And that's why it's important for Ney to seize this junction. Because if he can cut the road to Namur from Nivelles, and if he can cut the road from Brussels to Charleroi, that denies Wellington the ability to move troops fluidly towards the Prussians.
I believe at about 6 o'clock, actually, the Prince of Orange, who's in command of the First Corps, he actually arrives on the scene.
It's all very minimal. They've been holding this position for about 10 hours since the Red Lancers appeared the night before, and they were driven off by Prince Saxe-Weimar's brigade. But Ney didn't want to press on and take the crossroads that night, and hence we're in this position right now. Now, Prince of Orange appears, and he's with Constant Rebec, and he talks to General Paponche and Saxe-Weimar. He looks at the field, and he decides it's a good position.
You've actually got 2 princes against one here. Ney is a prince in the French Empire, and you've got, like you said, Prince Bernard of Saxe-Weimar again, and under the command of the Prince of Orange.
Things are about to kick off royally. At this stage as well, not long after the Prince of Orange gets there, the Duke of Wellington arrives at Quatre Bras.
A bit after, but not long behind.
And he gets there, and he tours the position, and he too decides it's a good enough position, we'll stand here. And essentially, that means the army who is already moving in this direction, that's now its goal to get there. And what he does then is he leaves the position because nothing's happening, and he rides down the Namur Road to have a talk with Marshal Blucher.
And they actually managed to meet.
They do.
At a famous windmill.
Bry.
And this is where Wellington's critics, Blucher's supporters, say that Wellington made a promise to come to Blucher's aid. But Wellington writes and recalls later that he wrote to come to Blucher's aid provided he wasn't delayed. This is where Napoleon is now bringing up the mass of his artillery, including his beautiful daughters of the Imperial Guard, his favourite guns, where he is an artillery officer, and it's what he knows how to use really well. And that's falling upon Ligny with the Emperor.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's important to remember that at this stage in the campaign, Quatre Bras is not the most important part for the Allies. Ligny is, because Napoleon is at Ligny. And it was roughly understood that whoever faced Napoleon had the strategic operational priority. that meant the Duke of Wellington was essentially obliged to come to Blucher's assistance rather than Blucher coming to Wellington's assistance. And it's interesting. It is a very contested point amongst historians about the promise. He made that promise based on a memorandum written by Howard de Lancey, his quartermaster general, that had been rather optimistic about the speed with which Wellington's army could concentrate. And he made that
quite a lot of distance to cover, and there's the genuine confusion of trying to get into battle, as we're saying, down these narrow roads.
Exactly, but of course at the same time he also did not know he was properly engaged, seriously engaged at Quatre Bras, because when he left, nothing was happening. Yeah. And so he basically said, sensibly, he said, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt that this happened, he said, I will come and support you here, providing I'm not attacked myself. Now, Prussian Chief of Staff Graf von Gneisenau doesn't like Wellington. He doesn't trust him.
It's quite a strange one. Gneisenau, though he's worked with the British, he's been to Britain, deeply distrusts, let's say, the British, but at least Wellington, and he's just not helpful in this. He's a fantastic general and a really good chief of staff, but he seems to kind of want to delay and hamper some efforts. Though Wellington's criticised for promising to come, Gneisenau's never trusted that anyway. So let's go on to Ney's attack, shall we?
Ney's first attack is very simple. It lasts about an hour. He has one division approaching, which is Jérôme Bonaparte's division.
So another prince, the 6th division. So we've got a 4th prince on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. And he has 2 divisions in the field, which I believe is General Foy's division and General Bachelet's division, supported by General Piret's light cavalry division of lancers and chasseurs. He has about 32 guns on a very low rise south of Gemiancourt.
Building them up en masse rather than the British Allied way was often to split them up between brigades and divisions to kind of supplement their firepower. This is the kind of grand battery which Napoleon and the Russians kind of went for, a big block of guns together. So it's not a huge amount, but certainly enough. But the majority are off at Ligny, about 250.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly more guns than the Prince of Orange has. And I think he only has about 1 or 2 batteries in the field at that moment. Basically,
saying it's about 4 to 6 guns.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes including a howitzer or 2. And these, they're the shell firers. And these 2 divisions that he has ready drive forwards, supported by the cavalry. They have a scrap with this Dutch-Belgian troops at Gemiancourt, but eventually prevail, pushing them back. And they take what is called Grand Pierrepont, which is just in front of the Bois de Boisseau, the southern edge of the Bois de Boisseau. And begin.
It's fighting down farms and woodlands at this point.
And they begin to assault the Saxe-Weimar's position in the woods. What has happened now, though, of course, this has taken about an hour, and the centre and left of the Dutch position is now falling back, and Ney reels his boys in, reforms them to drive at the crossroads. At this moment, Jérôme Bonaparte's division arrives, and he basically throws half of that at the Bois de Boisseau. And it's at this point where things are pretty much going to pot. After a gallant defence, it must be said, against superior numbers, Wellington arrives back and
finishes his meeting, and he's managed to basically canter all the way back across just at the height of that section of fighting.
It's getting on into midday now.
Yeah,
very hot.
By the time they get through, it's just after 1 to 2 o'clock by the time Wellington gets back and gets control of the situation. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the morning has been kind of wasted for Ney. The Allies are wanting a delay.
Wellington sees the situation in front of him, and he doesn't like it one bit. The Dutch are retreating as far as the eye could see. The forest on his right flank is coming under really heavy attack, and he orders the prince to get his guns back. A few hundred yards in front of Quatre Bras is a sheep farm called La Bergerie, and that is the only other feature in between Gemiancourt and Quatre Bras. and the Dutch guns are brought back up there, and pretty much Wellington's going to try and do a last-ditch stand to try and hold the Namur Road and Quatre Bras to stop communications being severed with the Prussians. And all this time, he's pretty much looking over his shoulder up the Brussels Road, looking for Picton's division, which he had last seen in the forest of Soignes that morning near Mont Saint-Jean.
That's what I was going to say. Eventually, it's Picton kind of leading the way. The British 5th Division come up the road. Picton, one of the other individuals there, not in dress uniform. The Duke's purposely wearing his blue frock, coat and hat, cockade hat. But Picton's basically lost his baggage. So he's in this famous top hat and brown long coat. And he comes leading the way up with quite an experienced division, the British 5th. And so they are more reliable as kind of to keep a foothold on to Quatre Bras.
It doesn't matter, to be honest, what troops arrive at this point. Wellington will throw anything into the position that he can get. And Picton happens to be the first one in. It's interesting, Picton didn't have his baggage with him. He had also, like Ligny, only arrived pretty much the day before.
They arrived on the night of the battle, and so Picton.
He was also famous in the Peninsular War for being very informal, and in fact his staff was called the Ragged Staff or something like that, because they never wore uniforms. So it's quite likely, even if he had his dress uniform there, he wouldn't have worn it.
I have heard one person write that he maybe lost it on purpose, so he didn't have to actually wear his uniform.
But what happens is, up comes the 95th Rifles, 1st Battalion, 95th under Colonel Bernard, and Fitzroy Somerset rides over to him, tells him the 95th are directed towards Teal on the left flank and the pools and ponds around a place called Materne. And they are it's a good light infantry country over there. It's very trappy.
This is the kind of areas that you can look at it with a modern eye. And this is the fantastic thing about the 95th, is they've got these famous green coats, which are performing a form of camouflage. They've got the now infamous Baker rifle, allowing them 3 to 4 times the distance of the rest of the infantry there. And this is where they can get into that ground and start picking off targets and actually do a lot of damage at Quatre Bras.
They go over there and they deploy. They go right into the action. They drive back a battalion of French skirmishes, I believe, and then, but they don't understand the Dutch, who are shouting at them as they advance, warning them how many French infantry are actually hidden amongst the hedges and corn around this. We'll call it a defile. It's talk of ponds and boggy ground and things like that.
When you go even see these battlefields, even with modern grass and modern corn, it's, as you know, anyone knows who lives out in the countryside, cornfields are about knee to thigh high, and that's because we've chosen breeds to lower the height, so you give you more crop effectively. Now back then there was less selection, so these fields of crop are, to the average guy, about like neck height. Now most of the soldiers are wearing these shako hats with a plume, so it does allow them an extra 1.5 feet on top. But simply to stoop or to kneel, you can lose a body of men in this ground quite easily. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what's happened.
Exactly. I've read estimates that the crops were standing up to 6 feet high. And if you imagine the fact that the average soldier of the 19th century, if he had fixed his bayonet, that bayonet tip was reaching to the top of his shako, then you get an idea of how difficult it would be to see them.
But the 95th, they actually march faster than everyone else. And it's a really hot day. I would say it's probably a really humid day. And actually their first casualty is not from that battle in the cornfield. It's one of their guys has basically a heat stroke. So it's also incredibly hot, humid weather bearing down upon them in these woolen uniforms with a felt hat, carrying their pack on their backs. And as you're saying, this ground's quite rough. The crops are hard, and you've got hedgerows to fight through as well.
They have to withdraw, essentially, although they were making progress, because there's too many French infantry down there, and in open order with rifles, you have to withdraw before formed infantry. This happens over probably like 20-30 minutes. Luckily, what's happened is behind them, lining the Namur Road, is now pretty much 2 good brigades of British infantry, camped in packs brigades.
The 42nd Black Watch, the 44th East Essex, and the Gordon Highlanders, the 92nd.
This begins the messy middle phase of the Battle of Quatre Bras. Ney has launched 3 now divisions straight at the enemy position, and they are moving up behind their skirmishes, cavalry in attendance, and they are going to try and take the crossroads. This is the second effective attack of the day.
It's a huge cavalry mass that he's now managed to get in there. Ney, this is.
Yes, he has PRAs, at least one brigade of PRAs, possibly 2, and General Kellerman's heavy cavalry is also going to arrive in the next hour or so. It's the Picton's division goes forward and checks. I think it's Bacheler's division on the right, and what happens then? And the Dutch-Belgian cavalry under Van Merlen, I think, arrived roughly at the same time, immediately thrown forwards because Wellington can see lance pennants in support of these advancing divisions. Line lances and line cavalry now in the front, but that's worse because Puret's division is a very experienced one. And
yes, it's the French 2nd Cavalry Division, and
yes.
They actually come down upon the 42nd Black Watch and the 44th East Essex. And actually maul them quite a bit. But there's a fight there for the colours.
There is indeed. It's a very famous and legendary moment in the history of the 42nd Black Watch and the 44th Foot. And I'm going to preface this by saying that both battalions had served in the Egyptian campaign. So at this moment, the brigade is paused, having just repelled the French infantry. They have advanced a little too far, perhaps, beyond support. They're in line, 2 ranks, which is the way the British fight.
It gives them superior firepower, but it keeps them very vulnerable.
And suddenly, it is brought to the attention of the commanders of the battalions, the 42nd possibly being the one on the right flank. The 92nd have been held back and are still on the road or something like that. But the 42nd are the flank, and it is brought to the attention of Colonel Macara, who is the officer commanding the battalion, that cavalry has been seen to his rear. This is the victorious light cavalry that had just seen off Van Merlen's men, and who poor Van Merlen's men have just been shot at by the 92nd as they retreat. And this is Puret's cavalry coming down at them. The story goes that a Highlander tells, who had formerly been a prisoner of war, tells his captain that this is French cavalry, because a lot of people couldn't tell the difference between the French cavalry and the Dutch cavalry.
It's really confusing, especially with the high crops, the smoke of the battle, and the very confusing uniform.
And because of this delay, the French cavalry menacingly and slowly start to move towards the exposed British infantry. The man who has raised the alarm begs his officer to allow him to take a shot at the enemy, just to see whether they'll react the way he thinks they'll react, and he gets the nod. 1 round, fire. He discharges his piece, and the things suddenly become very, very dangerous. They have to form a square. The bulk of the 42nd manages to close up and sort of condense on itself, but the light and grenadier companies can't get there in time.
They're meant to form the back of the square together, and it's meant to close in as a box. So they've actually got the furthest to go. It's meant to be marching in reverse. It's meant to be a slow, calm procedure as it kind of folds in around itself, like folding a napkin and tying up at the bottom. But they don't have very much distance. If you're shooting at them out with a musket, you've got 100 meters less than, and you've got horses with lances coming at them. So it starts to become a bit of a panic, and they're going to be going at the charge.
By the time the 3 faces are formed, the cavalry is essentially upon them. And Colonel Macara pretty much makes the call to close the square without the light and grenadier companies in it. Even then, as the next companies in line wheel to form the square properly and essentially cut off the poor guys outside, some French cavalry get in.
Closed inside their own square, so they're facing towards the packs of the men.
They mortally wound Colonel Macara. They go berserk inside there, trying to break the square up. 42nd is a good battalion. They stay steady, and they pretty much kill everybody they find inside that square and chuck their bodies out. But the poor light and grenadier companies get utterly mauled, and the Lancers just play havoc on them. They form rallying squares or masses, which is what you're supposed to do if you get caught outside.
Basically a huddle back to back.
Back to back, bayonets out.
Skirmishes, and I'm not sure how much this went on to the light companies, but it was certainly trained towards the light regiments, were taught two techniques to fight against Lancers.
Yes.
And this is where you're meant to face towards them, never run away. At the last moment, step inside to the left, so you're around their blind side, so they can't get the lance around you, and then try to tip basically the man off the horse or hit him with your bayonet. Actually would often taught just going in for the chest of the horse. The other ones, if you can't do that, was actually to kind of do a dramatic stage death, lie down and hope that they'll ignore you. But the problem you've got here is where they've actually been so frustrated by these squares is they're riding around and they've got time to stab men who are dead or dying anyway.
Indeed, the Lancers were very vindictive soldiers for some reason, and they would, just because they could, stab people on the ground.
But it must have been a very difficult decision because he's basically sacrificing the flank companies often thought was quite elite, either the tallest and the strongest, or for the grenadiers, and the quickest and the cleverest in theory for the light companies. And he's basically signing their death warrant to the Lancers out there.
Colonel Macara, who gets lanced by troopers who manage to pierce his square, doesn't die instantly, but sadly he is taken out of the square after all this is over in a blanket, and a bunch of Lancers catch them and basically murder him.
And this is where the Blackwatch think that's just beyond the pale, because he's basically being stretcher-borne to the rear, and they run him down, and they basically don't take any prisoners for the Quatre Bras and at Waterloo, and there's anecdotes of them shouting, and this is for Macara, as they shoot and stab French cavalry.
Yes.
These famous Highlanders of the Black Watch are really set into a rage, and that's their trigger point of killing their already wounded colonel.
So that blackens the hearts of the 42nd Highlanders against the French that day. But they survive, and when they begin to volley from the square, they save the remnants of the light and grenadier companies. However, what about the 44th? Off to the left of the Highlanders, and they're in line, and they have as little warning as, maybe less warning than the 42nd.
See the cavalry coming in.
Mm-hmm. They get hit next by the next squadron or troop of Lancers that is in line, and Colonel Hamilton doesn't have time to form a square. Now, as I said before, both the 42nd and the 44th had been in Egypt. However, there will be very few men who would remember Egypt in this action. However, he gives an order that had not been heard in a British battalion since Egypt, which is second rank, about face, present, fire. And that is essentially has the effect of the line standing back to back. The rear rank faces about and fires a volley into the French Lancers, and that checks them.
It's basically double-siding the line, so you can fight in both directions.
Mm-hmm. It's very risky, but it worked in Egypt. The Gloucester regiment had been attacked in the rear by French cavalry. They had faced about their rear rank, fired, and had fought them off. 44th now did this
back badge on a fort. So there would be one or two people there that would remember this, and it just works.
It just worked because it checks the French attack. They pull their horses.
The distance they've got to cover, that one shot is probably going to be all they've got.
That's point blank range.
Break the impetus of the French charge.
Even then, it's still risky. A knot of Lancers magnetise themselves on the colours in the centre, and there's a mad scrap as the Lancers try and grab the colours. Certainly one Lancer actually caught hold of the fabric, the yellow fabric of the 44th's regimental colour, and tried to tug it away from the ensign holding it. But in his panic, he probably must have wheeled his horse and tried to just gallop off. It tore, and so he tore away a scrap of the colour, and that was all they got of it. This mad melee, obviously, the 44th and 42nd survived it. They were very lucky, and they had to withdraw back up to the ridge. 5th Division has to pretty much pull back to the Namur Road because of the French cavalry, as we've just seen. Ney's strength now is fast becoming the fact that he has cavalry and Wellington doesn't. And now the Prince of Orange sees the 5th Division come up, and he leads his Dutch boys down to attack Gemiancourt again, and they're so successful. They're flying on the sort of the wings of success here, because he thinks that the 5th Division is going to sweep all before it, and he's doing a very heroic thing. He's waving his hat around, and they briefly stop the attack from developing. Unfortunately, they're dead wrong about the 5th Division being able to make an impression at this stage. They're caught out and bundled back unceremoniously towards Quatre Bras. And at this point, the next batch of reinforcements arrives in the form of some very sombre-coated gentlemen.
This is the Brunswick Corps, famously the Black Brunswickers. They're wearing all black woolen uniform under the Duke of Brunswick himself. They're coming barreling down this road, and they now reach the field with the Duke of Brunswick leading them.
Wellington, who is just feeding troops in as they come, he needs the Brunswick to shore up the Quatre Bras front in front of General Foy's division. And the Duke of Brunswick, whose name I believe is Frederick Wilhelm, he is an excellent fellow.
He's really good. I love he's got very piercing eyes, his little short curly beard. Yeah, he basically comes charging in.
Yes, he rides in with his troops. He's with his staff. He's puffing on a meerschaum pipe, and he's wearing
a man of many battles, very experienced, and also very dedicated. He deeply hates French for taking his country.
He's young and dynamic. He's a very heroic and gallant figure, and he's wearing a little forage cap on his head, and he's been, throwing himself down in the grass to look at maps and things on his way up. And now he leads his division into the fray. And they come forward and they hold the line for a considerable amount of time, at least long enough to buy enough time to keep the French occupied, but they cannot resist the French attack. The thing with the Brunswick division is it's actually quite inexperienced. There's a lot of young men in these battalions, especially the line battalions. They don't have the experience to hold their own against General Foy, who is a very experienced commander. And hit by artillery fire from Ney's battery on the low heights, and now being pressured by masses of skirmishers hidden in the fields, and unable really to commit themselves because of the hovering masses of French cavalry. Brunswick leads a cavalry charge. He does everything a general is supposed to do. He's a classic German general. He calls his men his children, and they call him their father. And it's as they are retiring up to the sheep farm of La Bergerie that tragically a bullet finds him, and he is taken to the rear.
That's unfortunately for Frederick Wilhelm a mortal wound. So there's two memorials near the crossroads, one to the Allied cavalry, but just south, right on the busy roads, actually now gated off, is a huge memorial to the Duke of Brunswick.
And now the French cavalry put in an appearance again, and we arrive at a very interesting piece of Wellingtonia as the French cavalry press once more against the retreating Brunswick Corps, and the Duke of Wellington, who has just sent the Brunswick Hussars forward to try and plug the gap, gets chased by French cavalry, and he has to find shelter amongst the Gordon Highlanders. And some people say he jumped straight over them, some people say he walked his horse through them, but either way, this is a bit of legend in Wellington's story, as he has to escape physically from the French cavalry.
He's an incredibly good horse rider. Not only did he learn it as a young boy, but actually as part of his military education at Angers Military Academy, he said that he picked up the French language, but the things that he really excelled at was fencing, dancing, and riding. And now at Quatre Bras, he's on Copenhagen, a racehorse that he's bought So he is dashing around this battlefield.
Mm-hmm. He then personally directs the 92nd in driving off the French cavalry with a volley. And so we'll speed up a little bit here. So what happens next is the French are pushing in through the forest, and they're putting big pressure on the main Allied line. The next reinforcements that arrive are Hackett's brigade and Kielmanseg's, I don't know how to pronounce it, Kielmanseg's Hanoverian brigade. Now the Hanoverians go to the left centre, and they secure it, and they robustly repel French cavalry attacks in square. Hanoverians perform splendidly at Quatre Bras. Hackett is sent right down the middle.
So 33rd, 69th, and 73rd.
And this is where a prop of yours is going to come in, because coincidentally, at this time, Ney is actually running out of options. His attacks have stalled. He doesn't have any more infantry to throw at Wellington. His infantry are still backed up down the road. The next reinforcement he gets is General Kellerman Count Valmy's heavy cavalry cuirassiers.
Which is mostly of cuirassiers. These men with breastplates front and back, and heavy lobster pot style helmets as well.
Absolutely. Although the 11th cuirassiers, who will be in action shortly, do not have front or back breastplates. And Ney, who desperately needs reinforcements to win the crossroads, because he knows Wellington is there now personally, and he knows that there are reinforcements pouring in. He has been in a battle with Napoleon to try and get d'Erlon's First Corps to come to his aid at Quatre Bras, whereas Napoleon has been trying to get d'Erlon for most of the day to come to Ligny to crush the Prussian right flank.
D'Erlon doing this kind of tick-tock between the two, marching off.
And ultimately, he is unable to get to either field. Ney, at this point, receives word that d'Erlon has turned around yet again, and in a rage, he knows he needs to buy time. So he turns to the Comte de Valmy, General Kellerman, and he basically tells him to take the crossroads with his cuirassiers. And General Kellerman gives him a look, and he says, well, can I have Piret's men to support me? And Ney says, fine, go, but go now. And Kellerman places himself at the front, leads them in a very, very famous and very, very effective charge that sweeps all before it.
They get in amongst, especially between the 33rd, the Duke of Wellington's own regiment, the West Riding, and the 69th South Links. And you're saying about props. Through a weird twist of fate, I've got an original cuirassier sword here. And so you can see that both the length of it and the deadliness of it. And it's a lovely item. It's got a really heavy guard. It's quite well balanced. About down here. With its double tang for strengthening as well. But one of these, it would be held out as a lance, going towards, basically towards the face of the opponent coming down. If someone was to run and flee, we were talking earlier about forming square, you would not need much effort from a great charger to bring one of these down, crushing through skulls. This one does actually date from October 1813. And it's stamped with the correct marks on it. And
this is the weapon, essentially, that brought destruction to Hackett's brigade. Specifically,
coming down.
Specifically, the 69th. The 33rd, formed square, came under artillery fire, reformed into columns. In the middle of doing that, someone cried cavalry, and they all ran into the woods. Unfortunately, the 69th lose their colour, their king's colour.
I believe the only battalion directly under Wellington's command who lose so at a really kind of a low point.
And that's carried off by a trooper called Ohm, I think, and laid at the feet of Marshal Ney. But again, the French cavalry save the day for Ney and buy him time that he hopes will allow him to get more men up to take the crossroads. But now, actually, coming up the Namur-Nivelles road is Cook's Guards Division.
Finally, the first British Infantry Division of Guards.
Yes, and 2 battalions, the 1st Foot, the 3rd Scots, 2nd Coldstream, all come piling down this road 2 battalions are detailed of the first guards, I believe, are detailed to the woods because Saxe-Weimar, who has gallantly been holding on with support from the Brunswick avant-garde battalion of sharpshooters, is now being pretty much bundled out of the woods, and they go in there, very experienced battalions, feeding them in 2 companies at a time in skirmish order, and they redress the balance.
They are the kind of the turning point in able to save the day. Indeed. After all, maelstrom of cavalry against line.
Because Wellington still does not have cavalry. Uxbridge's corps of cavalry is still just at Nivelles now. The Scots Greys, for instance, are just about at Nivelles now, and he's even like low on artillery batteries. Most of his artillery is being pounded mercilessly by Ney's guns, and this essentially brings us to the end of the Battle of Quatre Bras in a way, because more British and Allied divisions arrive, making Wellington now the dominant numerical force on the field. He gets so much infantry that he can now dominate this narrow space and prevent the French cavalry from getting at him.
And the battle's mostly been fought as quite a draw. There's very similar losses on both sides. Actually, more allies than French. Ney started off with hugely superior numbers. He didn't press the advantage, and his one objective was to capture the crossroads, with a secondary to then fall upon the Prussians. He definitely hasn't got anywhere near the Prussians. D'Erlon's basically been playing his game of two between the two. He's actually out, and the fighting's over at sunset, which is about 9 o'clock in the evening. It's, you remember, it's June, it's the height of summer, and in the evening, Wellington's got a British infantry division on the crossroads, so he's got use of the roads for the day.
And by nightfall, the cavalry are there as well, and he's ready by nightfall to fight again, technically, at Quatre Bras. We'll also say that when he got numerical superiority, he drove Ney back and reoccupied the original Dutch-Belgian line at Gemiancourt, Pierrepont, and Pierremont at the edge of the Boissou Wood.
He's basically taken all the ground that was lost that morning, and so Ney has lost all of his territorial gains.
And so now the question is, what happened to the Prussians? Now, we can't go into detail on this because this is mostly about Wellington's story, because it's what we...
Wellington.
Yeah. But we can say that a monstrously devastating battle occurred at Ligny as this was happening. By 3, Napoleon had expected Ney to have taken the crossroads, and around 3 was when, I believe, the attack on Ligny began. And it was a brutal, just face-to-face pounding match between Napoleon's army, which was smaller, 66,000 men in the field.
It is slightly smaller. It's by just under 20,000 men smaller. D'Erlon's corps would have tipped the numbers back in Napoleon's favour.
Because Napoleon thought that he was only opposing 1 corps at most at Ligny, and it was only as the battle progressed he realised he was actually facing the entire Prussian army, almost except for 1 corps.
The losses are certainly, they are devastating. It also has a psychological effect upon the Prussians, a lot of them being from the militia or the Landwehr, and there's a huge amount of desertion that afternoon and that evening. Somewhere 8,000+ men desert overnight. Napoleon
performed very competently at Ligny, it must be said. He did what Napoleon did. He massed his guns. He deployed his men exactly where he needed them to be. He took advantage of the really poor position, to be honest, that Blucher took up, which was packing a huge amount of men into a very small area, and especially into a salient.
He was funnels them in between 2 villages. Right in front.
He does. Which allows Napoleon to dominate that sector with smaller amounts of troops. By the end of the day, the hamlets that are built along the Lean Brook are burning wrecks of dead men and rubble. And at the end of the battle, climactic part of the battle, the Imperial Guard just marches through a rainstorm, bats away everything that Blucher can throw at it to stop it. Heavy cavalry coming in at the flanks. And this is without d'Erlon, which Napoleon waited an extra hour or two when he thought he was arriving, because they actually saw the heads of his column in the distance at one point. But Blucher gets actually ridden down by cuirassiers and contused.
An elderly man by this point.
Yeah, he tried to save the position physically, riding in to try and counterattack. But whatever the Prussians threw at the French were able to overcome it. Granted, they took 3 casualties themselves. They took about 8,000 casualties, maybe up to 12. It was actually quite similar casualties.
It's an estimate of similar casualties: 8 to 12 French, 12,000 Prussians, plus the desertion rates. But it is an obvious tactical and strategic victory for Napoleon.
At that moment, which is what Wellington doesn't know, is that his left flank is in the air. As of the night of the 16th of June, Napoleon would technically have been in a position to swing west and possibly catch him in the flank. And so that's where we are at the end of the 16th of June. The Prussians are reeling backwards, and only good staff work is going to save them. Because as far as General Gneisenau was concerned, it may be with guns that war is made, but they're often won with a good supply of ink and paper.